Hello and welcome to Gin with Gwynne. I'm Oliver Gwynne. This is where I give you my off-the-cuff and unrehearsed thoughts on marketing, data, and philosophy. This week I'm talking about the Cobra Effect and Goodhart's law. What is the Cobra Effect? Well, India is ruled by the British Empire, and there's a real problem with rattlesnakes and cobras. And so the British Empire starts to give a bounty for anybody who presents a dead wild snake. And chasing and killing snakes is quite a lot of work. I personally wouldn't know this, but it's a bit of a hassle. And so what do the Indian people start doing? They start breeding a load of cobras at home, killing them, taking the dead bodies, and then getting their bounties. And the British Empire gets wind of this, and so they decide to scrap the whole thing. And so there was at this point thousands of cobras being bred specifically to get the bounty. And what happens after the bounty is scrapped? They're all released back into the wild. And in fact, you ended up with more cobras than you originally started with, increasing the problem. And this is a good example of Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Why is it called Goodhart's law? Because you have to have a good heart and still end in the wrong direction. No, it's because the guy's name was Charles Goodhart. So metrics are proxies for success, but they are not success itself. And once incentives are attached to a specific metric, people will optimize towards that metric rather than the underlying goal. This is something I've talked about before, in that I always think about uh, data needs to ladder up to decisions, decisions need to ladder up to behaviors. This is a great example of how if you don't have the right behaviors, then you start optimizing towards the wrong thing. And this is something that happens all the time in business. This could be vanity metrics replacing real performance. So teams optimize impressions or clicks or followers rather than revenue and profit. In advertising, it could be CTR, click-through rates. Ads become really clickable and clickbaity to get people onto your site, but they're not necessarily very persuasive. In sales, the one that I've often said is you tell your sales team that they have to get first calls, and so they'll just have a call with anybody. They'll spend hours of their time talking to people, but they won't be the right people. Customer service agents might optimize for call time rather than actually solving problems. So they're trying to get people off the line quickly, but then they don't solve the problem. They don't spend time understanding the problem properly. And so people come back or the problem is not solved. In SEO, it might be that content is written to rank rather than actually providing value, which is what happened for a long time. And I suspect will start happening again because of LLMs. The structural reasons why it happens are that metrics are easier to manage than outcomes. Organizations prefer what can be measured quickly and easily and black and white normally, which is not so easy, but that's what we like as an organization. Um, but incentives always going to distort behavior. Compensation, bonuses, or targets are tied to a single KPI. You're always going to aim towards that, even if it doesn't necessarily relate to the underlying thing that you're aiming towards. And systems optimize locally. So departments optimize their own KPI, even if it harms the overall business in some cases. So, how do you know if this is happening to you? And I would say it's something that happens quite often. Things to look out for are that performance metrics improve, but business outcomes stagnate. So it looks like you're doing better, you're getting more clients, you're converting more people, but actually your money isn't growing, people aren't staying longer. That would be a sign that maybe you're optimizing towards the wrong things. Teams argue about attribution and measurement rather than impact. I've worked with sales teams in the past where there's been full shouting arguments about who converted a client because somebody in marketing had the last conversation with somebody who then converted, and the salesperson has spent 3 or 4 years of their life chasing this person. That's the sort of thing that can happen quite easily. And the marketing person in this case did not get any bonus based on it. So it wasn't like arguing or anything, but the salesperson was very determined, as you can imagine, because, they've been chasing that person for 4 years, but these are the things that happen. So um, arguing about attribution and measurement rather than the impact. Sudden improvements in a KPI with no clear causal driver would be another case that maybe this is happening. Teams teams become risk averse because targets dominate decision making. So thinking about behaviors and sales teams, this is you're persuading people, you're doing dodgy deals, you're promising things that the product can't deliver just to get people in because that's what your metric is. And it hurts the rest of the business. It hurts the pipeline in the long term. That's something that happens all the time. And then another sign might just be like complexity in tracking rather than clarity in strategy. You know, attribution can get quite grey and difficult in omni-channel world, but it should be relatively straightforward, the rules that you're in place. So these would all be signs that maybe it's happening to you. And how can you reduce it? Use a cluster of metrics rather than single KPIs. I think there was a rumor recently that Google unveiled OKRs as a way of disrupting their competition. But yeah, you don't have one single KPI that you're aiming towards. It should be revenue, contribution margin, and retention as a cluster of metrics that you're sort of basing performance on rather than a single thing. Separate diagnostic metrics from performance metrics. So not every metric should be incentivized. That's really important. Measure outcomes, not just activity. Profit, customer lifetime value, retention. And that's kind of difficult in a lot of scenarios because you don't control a lot of the things that ultimately sway to an outcome. You often don't control 90% of a prospect's journey. You only control them when they use your service, but even then, you don't control their relationship to your service or your category particularly. So it's difficult to always measure outcomes, and in some cases, you want to reward activity because people are often doing things that are thankless tasks towards something, especially in the sales arena. If you're cold contacting people on a daily basis, you should reward that behavior because you want to say, hey, just get in front of 50 people. Now, some of them will convert. If you only say to them, I'm only going to pay you for the ones that convert, then that would be very, people will get put off. You'll churn more staff. It takes time to train staff and hire them and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes, yeah, you do want to actually think about the activity, but in a lot of cases, you do need to think about the underlying outcome of what that team is there to do. I do see this quite a bit with data teams where they really do think that their job is reporting for some reason. And I'm like, that's not what your job is. You're basically insights people. That's what you should be producing. Yeah, some of that is to automate some reporting to save some time, but the bulk of your job should be to help optimize every part of the business. If you are just modeling all day, then that activity has no bottom line income other than hoping that the metrics will be used by people and maybe they'll do something. But if you're not part of the process of improving the business, then that's not really a good thing. Another thing that you could do to reduce it is focus incentive on long-term outcomes. So prevent short-term optimization behavior. This is more difficult if you have like quarterly reviews and stuff, even yearly reviews in some cases, but think about the long term in terms of what most positively impacts the business. And reward judgment, not just numbers. Encourage teams to challenge metrics when they appear misleading. It's really difficult sometimes setting goals because you want to set something ambitious, but you also want it to be realistic. And as I said before, quite often there's 90% of something that is not in your team's control. So you don't want to make people feel bad if they're not hitting the metric and they're doing all the right things. You kind of want to reward that, as I said before. Goodhart's law kind of highlights the limits of technocratic management. Modern organizations often believe that better measurement automatically leads to better decisions, and that's not always the case. I think it's often better to have a number that's sort of mostly right but is consistent than something complicated that is difficult to judge and difficult to make decisions on. Better measurement to better decisions is not always the case because decisions are often quite tactical in nature. They're often quite limited. You can't change your entire business every few weeks based on the data. That's just not a thing that you can do. And whilst every part of every business can be optimized, sometimes the small things don't make a huge difference, but people spend time changing what color the button is or trying different things, and they don't actually optimize the big things. And so Yeah, measurement is not going to solve that problem. You can have great product analytics, which will tell you in depth how people are using that and the impact on LTV and all of that kind of stuff. But that doesn't necessarily lead to better decisions if you're optimizing this when this is really the problem. And often people don't want to change this because it takes longer to change the direction of the ship. Metrics are maps of reality, but they're not reality itself, and that's always important to bear in mind. And it's a little bit like, there's the spirit of the law that people talk about, and there's the law, which is the black and white thing. And there's often a difference between those two things. If you're over reliant on metrics on the opposite side of the things, it can replace judgment with optimization, which can also be difficult in some cases. I think you need a mix. You need to make data-informed decisions, and then from there, go on your go on your experience. You hire intelligent people who are not just ChatGPTing things, I assume, and so it makes a lot of sense to trust their judgment if you've hired them to do the job. And if they've got data to back up those decisions, it makes sense. But sometimes the gap between the data and the decision is quite big. So it's all about how can you use metrics in a useful way, in a practical way, to make quick decisions, to make correct decisions on a regular basis without needing to spend a lot of time getting into the crux of answers. Sometimes that's, of course, what's needed when you're dealing with difficult questions, but that's how I like to think about in the context of Goodhart's effect. Metrics should act like the instruments in a cockpit. They guide the decisions, but the pilot still flies the plane. And I know in real life, 90% of the time, the plane is automated and they just do the takeoff and landing and all that kind of stuff, but my point is good, so I'll stick to my point. So this is the Cobra Effect and Goodhart's law. It's really all about the fact that everybody wants to be data-driven. They want to arm their people with the best insights, and they want it to be automated and correct every time, and to centralize a complicated journey into a single metric. But when you are thinking of the behaviors of teams and how you are going to reward them, sometimes that can diverge where the metrics can blind you to either A, the reality of how hard your team is working and actually so they should be rewarded for the behavior, or B, the fact that they are optimizing towards something that actually is not really great for your business and it's not helping the bottom line. Those have been my thoughts this week. Thanks very much for tuning in for another Gin with Gwynne.